Okay, now I can go. All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad everybody's here. As we were just talking, happy Pi Day. So this morning I mentioned in a meeting, if you're looking for something, a gift for that special someone on Pi Day, on this great holiday, go look on Amazon for a book called The First Million Digits of Pi. It is a book that has 3.1415 blah 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 all the way the first million digits of pi, page after page of numbers. So if you're looking for a special present for somebody, that's a great Pi Day present.
Or a good techie Rick-rolling present.
Or just something for super nerds, right? I guess. I don't know. Which, not that any of you are, don't get me wrong, but I am. So I might like that. It's a good read. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So today, I guess I'm going to share my screen. Today we are going to talk about DAPR, DAPR. Now, before I get really digging into this, I usually like to give a little introduction as to who I am, right? Most of you on the call probably know who I am. If you don't, good on you. That's probably better for you. But I'm going to give a little overview about who I am. So my name is Troy Fillerup, and that really is my last name, which is odd, I know. I am a practice success manager at Software Technology Group. So essentially, I'm over a couple of the practices here at STG. And one of my main jobs is to try to help our consultants maximize their marketability, increase their skills, and kind of know where to go in the industry. I've been at STG for almost 20 years now. And so I've been at STG longer than some of you have probably been alive. So that's how old I am. I also helped co-found the Salt Lake Azure Group. It's a user group here in the Salt Lake area for, as you might have guessed, Azure. And we haven't been meeting for a while, but we're hoping to start meeting again in April. So if anybody's interested in coming to the Salt Lake Azure Group, we have a lot of great content that we talk about. Obviously, Azure is huge, and so there's tons of things to discuss. And I've been a Microsoft developer since the VB3 days. So that kind of tells you how long it's been. VB3 was a great tool, but boy, I'm sure glad we got away from that. So that's a little bit about me. Now, what I like to do in all my presentations is give a little tech tip that is not necessarily associated with what we're talking about. But it's just something that's useful, and this is useful really only for people that use Visual Studio. So I apologize to those of you that don't. Feel free to turn your speakers off for a second or something. But I just wanted to show you this cool little feature of custom snippets in Visual Studio. So let's say you're writing some code and you have a block of code that you want to reuse, right? Typically, you just cut and paste that somewhere, cut and paste it 20 times. But you might want to use it later, or you might want to use it another day or something like that. So you can actually take blocks of code and you can drag them right over here into your toolbox, and then they become a reusable snippet right there in your toolbox. And I know that since we don't do a lot of WYSIWYG form building anymore, the toolbox is kind of underused nowadays, but this is a real great use for it. So now, if I come in here and I create a new class right here, then I can just put my cursor somewhere, double click on this, and it pops it right in. You can actually also drag it in here if you want. So you can drag it and drop it right here, which probably isn't good because now that's not going to compile. But it's kind of a useful little feature if you have a bunch of code snippets that you typically use and you don't want to have to remember to cut and paste or find them or copy them. Just pop them right there in your toolbox. So that is our tech tip of the day. Let's go ahead and as we go on, please feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. I'll try to pay attention and answer them as best I can. Feel free to interrupt anytime, and we'll see if we can get you taken care of. So let's go ahead and dig into DAPR. So what is DAPR? Well, DAPR is not the ORM. I know a lot of people are familiar with the DAPR ORM. That's not what this is. So if you came to this presentation hoping to learn about the DAPR ORM, you will be sorely disappointed. But stay on anyway, because the DAPR that we're going to talk about is kind of cool. So DAPR stands for Distributed Application Runtime. And it's essentially a bunch of APIs that make connecting and building microservices much easier. So on the DAPR website, it says it provides APIs that simplify microservice connectivity. Whether your communication pattern is service-to-service invocation or pub-sub messaging, DAPR helps you write resilient and secured microservices. So DAPR it runs as a sidecar in your Docker container. And essentially what it does is it takes a lot of the heavy lifting away from the menial tasks of building your microservices, whether it is your service-to-service invocation, state management, pub-sub. So if you look up here in this thing across the top, DAPR consists of a suite of building blocks. Okay, and these are the different building blocks that DAPR has. We have service-to-service invocation, makes it easy to call other microservices. It also has state management. So if you're running long-running services that you want to be stateful, you can use their state management to save it into Redis or Cosmos DB or numerous other state providers. Pub-sub, so you could use Azure Service Bus, Azure Event Hub. You can use Redis and stuff like that. Bindings, actors, you can see that there's a whole bunch of different of these building blocks that DAPR provides. And the beauty of DAPR is that it does all the heavy lifting, and all you have to do is use the DAPR APIs and a config file to tell DAPR where to go. And we'll show that once we get into the demos. Now, why would you want to use DAPR? Well, the main reason is because it simplifies things, right? It makes things easier, and it handles all of the best practices that you need for microservices. So it deals with the secured connections. It handles resiliency. It handles retries. For the pub-sub, it handles guaranteed message delivery. So it handles all this kind of stuff behind the scenes for you so that you can focus on the business logic rather than all of the plumbing that your microservices require. Also, DAPR allows you to interact with it through HTTP or gRPC. So that means that any language that you use, no matter what, if it can make an HTTP call, you can use DAPR. Now, there are some SDKs that we'll talk about in just a second that make it even easier to use if your particular language has an SDK support. But if your language doesn't have SDK support, like I said, you can do it all with HTTP or gRPC. And we looked at the building blocks a second ago, but each building block has multiple components inside of it, and there are currently over 100 components available that you can use to access all kinds of different services in all kinds of different providers. And we'll take a look at those later on as we get into our demos. So as we look here, these are the SDK or the languages that have SDKs. So again, all APIs are available through HTTP, but a lot of times it's easier to use an SDK if your language provides that, right? It's a matter of, for instance, for .NET, to make a call to the DAPR sidecar is 2 lines of code, and it's really super easy. And then your config file. So you can see .NET, Python, Java, Go, PHP, and JavaScript all have stable SDKs, and then C++ and Rust are currently in development. And as DAPR gets more popular and starts growing some more, I'm sure that there'll be more SDKs built for it as we go. So the demos that we're going to show today are actually built in .NET, and we'll use the .NET SDK, but we'll also play a little bit with the HTTP stuff as well. So here's some of the components that we have in our building blocks. So you can see that we have here, we have our state store building block, and inside of that we have DynamoDB, Cosmos DB, Redis, Cassandra, all these different things that we can use for a state store. For our pub sub brokers, here are the different pub sub brokers, and this is only a small subset of them. We'll look at some more of them in a minute. Binding and trigger secret stores. So it makes accessing your secrets much easier, so that you don't have to remember, are we using Azure Key Vault? Are we using AWS Secrets Manager? And using the SDKs for those individual providers. For observability, it does App Insights, it does Zipkin. And Zipkin and Redis are installed on your local machine when you set up the DAPR CLI and the DAPR runtime on your local machine, so that you can play around with these things. And then when you go to production, like let's say, for instance, on your local machine, you just want to have a simple state store so that you can test your microservices locally. So you use the local Redis that's installed. But then when you go to publish it into the cloud, you want to use Cosmos DB for that. And so all you do is you change your configuration when you publish to the cloud, and it'll automatically use Cosmos DB without you having to change anything in your code. And we'll show how that all works out. In fact, let's take a quick look at some of the components that they have in here. Let's see. So if we go look at the building blocks, these are the different building blocks that we have. We have service invocation, state management, pub sub, bindings, and bindings are both input and output bindings. So you could set up a binding to take data from like an Azure Event Hub, for instance. And then you set up an output binding to go to an SMTP. So it makes it really easy to do those workflows doing that. You have observability, secret management, configuration, and all these other things. Now, if we go look at, for instance, the state management building block, you can see, let's see, where is it? Oh, so if we go look at the state store, so the state management building, these are all of the different components that it supports. So the Aerospike, Apache Cassandra, it has an in-memory state store if you want. Now, this is really only for development purposes, right? You can use MongoDB, MySQL. We have some AWS stuff, some Cloudflare stuff. You can see that there's tons of these different things that you can use. We're gonna mess around with the Azure Blob storage and with the local Redis one when we get to our demos. And so there's all kinds of these things. If we go back here and we look at our pub sub brokers, we have Kafka, again, in memory. We have Redis, we have RabbitMQ, and for Azure, we have Event Hubs, we have Service Bus Queues and Service Bus Topics. And just so you know, Service Bus Queues are actually new. They just came out with version 1.10, which is the latest version. But if you've been using DAPR at all and you were using a version before 1.10, then Service Bus Queues weren't available. So you can see that there's tons of different components and building blocks that you can use to build your microservices. So this is an example of an application that you might want to use DAPR for. So you have these here are your microservice containers, right? So again, DAPR runs as a sidecar inside of your container. Okay, so anytime you want to use DAPR, you'll just instantiate it as a sidecar inside of the container that your microservice is running in. And so here we've got a service that's using DAPR to have an input trigger. It's using it for its state management. It's using it for its service invocation right here, calling another method or another microservice. And it's also using it for pub sub. So this single DAPR sidecar can handle all of these different operations just by calling the various methods on the DAPR SDK or the HTTP endpoint. So this service here is using it to retrieve a secret from the secret store, whatever that happens to be, whether it's Azure Key Vault or Amazon Secrets Management or whatever. You use DAPR to do that. And then over here, you're subscribing to what was published over here, and then you have an output binding. So this is an example of a whole system that you can use DAPR for. And DAPR can be used in bits and pieces, right? You don't have to use DAPR in every microservice all the time. You can just use it where it makes sense, and you can add it later if you need to do that as well. So how do you get started with DAPR? I mean, that's what we're going to talk about next, is how to get started, how to set it up on your machine, and how to play with it. So there's 4 steps really to get going with DAPR. The first thing is you need to install the DAPR CLI. And we're going to go through all of this here in just a second. And then you need to initialize DAPR, which installs the runtime and does some things on your machine. Then we're going to test DAPR using HTTP. And then you can go to the GitHub repo to play with the quick starts. And what we're going to do is when we get to the demo section, we're going to build a couple of projects using .NET and show you how it not only runs locally, but we're going to put it up in Azure as well. And I'm going to show you some cool things that Azure does with DAPR. So first of all, let's go ahead and install the DAPR CLI. So let me get out of that, and we're going to go to, oh, here it is. Okay. We're going to install the DAPR CLI. Now, there's several ways to do that. You can install this on Windows or Linux, depending on what you want. I run Windows, and even in Windows, you can install it into your WSL instance if you want to do that. But the easiest way to do it on Windows is by using a tool called Winget. And if nobody's heard of Winget, then what you need to do is just go to the Microsoft Store and download and install Winget. It's just a really easy way to install stuff for Windows. It's kind of like NuGet, but instead of for packages, it's for applications. So once you get Winget, and you can look at here, if you go to this URL, and I'll put this in the notes. This is where you can go to get Winget and how you can use Winget. Okay, but so in order to install the DAPR CLI, you just do winget install dapr.cli, and then it's going to go through and it's going to install everything you need for the CLI portion. But then you need to do you need to do a little thing to get it to fully function. And that is the DAPR init. So what you're going to do next is you're going to go to your command line. You're going to type DAPR init. So if we go into our Windows terminal here, I've already done both the winget DAPR CLI and the DAPR init. So if we go look at DAPR-V, it'll show you the CLI version that you're running and the runtime version that you're running, okay? And 1.10.0 is the very latest, because I just did this morning. Now, it turns out if you want to update to the latest version of DAPR, you need to uninstall the old one and just do this process again, which I found out the hard way this morning. But we got it taken care of and it's working, so that's all I care about. Now, one of the things that the DAPR init does is it goes in and installs a couple of Docker containers on your machine. So it's important that if you're going to do this, you need to have Docker installed on your machine, whether it's Docker Desktop or whatever. So I've got Docker Desktop for Windows installed. You can see that here. And if you go look at your containers running, so if we do Docker PS here, you can see that we've got the DAPR demo state. So this is the container that runs DAPR, right? You've also got this DAPR zip, or this Zipkin container. And this is an observability container that DAPR uses to give you all kinds of cool information about what's going on in your DAPR environment. We'll take a look at that here in a minute in our demos. And then it also installs a Redis container. And Redis is a state store. You can also use it for PubSub. And so it's a really great way to play around with this stuff on your local machine without having to get a cloud provider involved if you don't want to, right? So it installs those containers. And then once you do that, once you do the winget and once you do the CLI, then you're ready to go ahead and just start playing with it. And we're going to do some HTTP calls, and I'll show you just how to play with it through HTTP. So the first thing that we're going to need to do if we just want to play around with this is we need to run DAPR. And we do that with DAPR run. You need to give it an app ID. So we're going to call it, oh, I don't know, STG brown bag. And we're going to give it an HTTP port for it to listen on. Okay, now, so DAPR is now up and running. So DAPR is listening for our HTTP commands. So what I'm going to do is I have this set up. So by default, when you install DAPR, it sets up some config files to use Redis as your state store. And so I'm gonna play around with setting and retrieving state, and it's going to use the Redis container that it set up by default. So we're going to go here and we're going to do some PowerShell to make an HTTP REST call. So I need to bring up another tab over here. So I'm going to invoke this REST method. I'm going to post some content to our DAPR container, right? So here's our URL. It's localhost 3500. Remember, because I set the app port to be 3500. And then we're going to call state/state store. And I'm going to pass in this data. So if we hit enter there, it finished. Now you're like, okay, great, that didn't do anything, so what? But what we can do now is we can go see if it actually worked. And whether or not this works, I promise it worked this morning. So if it fails now, it's because the demo gods don't like me. So let's see what happens. So I'm going to do a get. So I'm going to invoke the REST method. I'm going to do a get to that exact same URL, right? And when I do that, you can see I get Bruce Wayne, because we put the state in there of the name Bruce Wayne. Now, you're probably asking yourself, well, how do I know that's just not stored in memory somewhere and that you're not just faking it? Well, I can show you that. So what we can do is we can actually get into our Redis container and take a look and see what's in there. So we're going to do Docker exec. We're going to go interactive. We want to get into the DAPR Redis container, which is the one that DAPR installed for us. And I want to invoke the Redis CLI. So this is going to let us, play around inside of Redis and see what's in there. So we're going to get a list of all the keys that are in there. And you can see I've been playing with this for a little bit, which is why there's so much stuff in here. But the one that we're interested in is that number 2, that state demo. So I'm going to do an hgetAll. And then I need to pass in the state demo STG value. Okay, that's not the one. Oh, sorry. I've got so many in here, I forgot. So it's actually not the state demo. It's the STG brown bag, right? Because that's what I called it up top, now that I remember. So we're going to look at the value of the STG brown bag name. And there you can see we've got Bruce Wayne. And you see there it's version 1. But if I come out here and I run that post again, and I'm going to put in a different name this time. We'll call this Clark Kent, this one. And then if we go back into our Redis CLI and we do the hgetAll again, now you can see that it's Clark Kent and it's version 2. So it's storing it in Redis, which means that any microservice that we use on our local machine that's using that same Redis configuration can get that state and update that state. And again, this was just by using a config file. Okay. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at the quick starts. So there are a bunch of quick starts that we have available to us if we want to get started with this. So if we go to GitHub and go to DAPR/quick starts, it has a bunch of samples for a ton of different languages, right? So we've got, so here's our pub sub examples. We've got C#, Go, Java, JavaScript, Python. And if you go into those, like in C#, we've got HTTP examples and SDK examples. So there's a lot of good content in here on learning how to use DAPR and learning how to run with DAPR. So let's see what's next. Oh, so our next thing is a demo. So I guess I didn't need to bring that slide up because we're just going to go right into the demos. All right. So is there any questions before I get into the demos? I know I kind of talk fast and go fast and loose with things. I'll take just a second if anybody has any questions. Well, I guess those crickets mean no. So we'll just move on then. All right. So what we're going to do is I'm going to do two demos. I'm going to do one with the state store, and I'm going to do one with PubSub, and then we're going to look at how we can put these into Azure. So let me bring up my command line. So here we have, this is going to be our state demo, and I'm doing this in Visual Studio. So I'm going to show you the Visual Studio. So this is the project that I'm doing. It's very simple. What I'm doing is I'm just setting a store name called State Store, and I'll show you how that's used here in a second. And then a key name called STG value. So this is similar to what we just did with the HTTP stuff, but this is in a .NET project using the SDK. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to come into here, and I'm making some minimal APIs that we're going to use to update the state and retrieve the state. Okay. And so I have a post here and a get. And so the post is going to set the state. The get is going to retrieve the state. And the way that we do that is we instantiate an instance of the DAPR client, right? Which means that we have to have this using DAPR client up here at the top. And that means that we have to make a reference to DAPR client as a NuGet package. So you do install package dapr.client, okay? Then we can use the using DAPR client, and then we instantiate an instance of the DAPR client. And then all we need to do is we call DAPR client.saveStateAsync. We pass in the store name, the key, and the value. And that's all there is to it. That goes and it stores that data inside of our Redis container. And that's all we had to do. We didn't have to know anything about Redis. We didn't have to know anything about containers. All we had to do was call this DAPR client.saveStateAsync. Same thing with the get. We're going to instantiate a DAPR client. We're going to get the value. So here we're doing a get state async from that store name. And then we're going to return that value. And so you're asking yourself, well, how does it know to use Redis? That doesn't even make sense. Well, that's all done by configuration, okay? So if we go look in our, let's see, let me bring this up. So if we go look in our file system, we have this components folder. So you can see here's my DAPR state demo. Here's a components folder. Inside that components folder, we have a couple of YAML files. These are the YAML files that DAPR will use to determine which components to use. So if we open up this statestore.yaml, okay, you can see here that we have a YAML file that defines what our state store is going to be. So we give it the name of state store, which is what we used in our code, if you'll recall, right? And then this is how we define it. So in this case, we're using the Redis provider, or the Redis component. It's version 1. And then we have to pass in some metadata as to how to access that Redis component. So we give it the name, we give it, and this is, or we give it the endpoint, it's localhost 6379, which if you go look in our Docker instance here, that's the port that it's using. We give it a Redis password, and you can tell that this password is super secure, but that's okay because nobody's going to guess this password. Everybody's going to think, oh, there's got to be something there, right? And then the actor state store is true. Now, if we wanted to change this and use Cosmos DB, all we need to do is change this YAML file, not change the code at all, and then it would use Azure Cosmos DB. And we'll show you how to do that up in Azure here in just a second. Okay. So now the thing is that we really can't run this from Visual Studio. And the reason for that, and we can, but I don't have it set up to do that right now. The reason for that is because we need to do a DAPR run, and we need to launch the DAPR sidecar along with the container running our application. Okay. So you kind of have to do a couple of different operations to do that. And I actually like to use a tool called Project Tye. By raise of hands, does anybody know what Project Tye is? T-Y-E. I can see Jen shaking her head. Yeah. So Project Tye is a way that you can launch multiple things at once just using a YAML file. And DAPR, or Project Tye, has built-in support for DAPR. So this is the YAML file for Project Tye. So what I'm saying here is I want to launch this using DAPR, and this is what I'm going to launch is this project. Okay. If you're interested in Project Tye, just go to GitHub and search for Project Tye, and you can find that. And there's some really cool things that Tye provides that we'll take a look at.
That's Tye, T-I-E.
T-Y-E. T-Y-E. Yep. Project Tye. And I'll show you some of the things that it gives us. So we're going to come into here, and we're going to go into our DAPR state demo. So we're in the folder for that demo that I was just showing you the code. So all I need to do is I need to do Tye run. If I hit that, then the Tye engine is going to fire up DAPR and fire up my container and get everything up and running. Now you'll notice that we have this dashboard running on 127.0.0.1:8000. So if we go to that link in our browser, where is it? Hold on. Let me bring it up. Okay, you get this nice little dashboard that Project Tye provides for you, right? So you can go and see all of the services that you fired up with Tye, and then you can go in and look at the different log files for those services, okay? So we're going to see if this is working. So the way we're going to do that, since this is an HTTP endpoint, we're going to use Postman to do that, okay? And so as we look in our Project Tye, so we saw this, it fired up our service on localhost 51863. Okay, so that's where it launched that. So we're going to go to localhost 51863, and we're going to send it a value called eat some pie. Well, let's do something different because I did that earlier. Happy Pie Day. Okay. When we send that through a post, okay, so first of all, it's very important that you put in the right port number. If you fat finger the wrong port number, it does not work. So I had to do that. Now let's try it again. And there it worked. So this post, all it does is it saves that value to the state, and then it just returns the value so that we can see that it did something. Okay. So now if we go and do a get, you can see that it returns the same thing. So that did a get from our Redis state. So let's go check our Redis again and make sure that it actually did put it into Redis like we thought. So if we check out our keys again, and we have our state demo, so we're going to do an hgetAll. And there you see we have Happy Pie Day. So it's saving it to the state and retrieving it from the state just by calling that DAPR endpoint. Okay, so that is all for the state. Any questions on the state store? Okay, let's move on to a demo that's a little bit more interesting. Maybe not super duper interesting, but hopefully a little bit more interesting anyway. Let's go look at a pub sub example. So here we have, let's bring up the project and we'll go through what it looks like. So here we have a pub sub demo. I have two projects in here. One that publishes events to a pub sub provider, and then another one that subscribes to those events. Okay, so it's like if you're thinking about this, think of like RabbitMQ would be one of these, or Azure Service Bus would be something that you could use here. Locally, we're going to use the Redis container that comes built in, but then we're going to put this into Azure and see how we can use Azure resources to do this. Oh, actually, you know what? Let me back up. Sorry, I apologize. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me show you the Azure thing first. So in the Azure stuff, what I've done is I actually went ahead and did the state store up in Azure. So I'll show you how that works instead. I apologize. I'm just getting ahead of myself a little bit. So let's go look in Azure, and I'll show you how easy it is to set this up up there. So Azure has this neat little resource. It's fairly new called Azure Container Apps. And what that allows is that allows you to deploy containers really easily in Azure and run them with very low friction. So Kubernetes is very powerful, and you can do a lot in Kubernetes, but sometimes it's overkill for what you need. And sometimes you don't want to learn all of the ins and outs of Kubernetes or hire a Kubernetes expert to manage all of that. Azure Container Apps is an easy way to get containers up into Azure. And the beauty about Azure Container Apps is this little thing right here. So you can see that it has native support for DAPR built right into the Azure Container Apps. And so you can develop all your stuff on your local machine. And then once you publish it into Azure, it's automatically going to use the DAPR configuration that you have in Azure without you having to do anything. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to set up an Azure Container App. And then if you go into the DAPR section of your settings here, you're going to want to turn that on. So you're going to want to be enabled. So by default, DAPR is not enabled. Turn that on. Give it a port number. I gave it port 80. And then you're going to set up your components. So you can see I have a state store component. And the components are part of the DAPR Azure Container Apps environment. So you have an Azure Container Apps environment, and then you can have multiple container apps inside that environment. So all of the container apps inside that environment are going to use the same DAPR configuration, okay? So I set up a state store, and this has all of the same information that the YAML files do when we have it on our local machine. So we give it the state store, and we give it a name. I called it state store. And then we give it our component type. So when we're running local, it's Redis, right? Because we're using our local Redis instance. But when we're putting it up here, we're going to use blob storage for our state store up in Azure. And then we're going to come down here, and we're going to put down this information for our state store. So for blob storage for Azure, we need to have three pieces of information. We need to have the account name, we need to have the account key, and we need to have the container name that that data is going to go into, okay? And unfortunately, I don't have time to go through how to build all of this. If anybody has any questions on how to put all this together, we can feel free to hit me up offline, and we'll go over stuff like this. So I've already got the storage account set up. I already got the DAPR configuration set up, and I've already got my app published to this DAPR state store as well. So you're just going to have to trust me that I just took the same code and pushed it up there. And I'm a pretty trustworthy guy. Just ask Jen, she'll tell you. So I went and I just published up the code that I showed you into an Azure Container App. And this is the URL that Azure Container Apps gave me. Okay, so I know it looks really bad, and you can set custom URLs and stuff, custom domains. I didn't want to do that. This is just the default one that Azure provides. So we're going to come in here and we're going to do a post, and we're going to say value equals This is Pi Day. Okay, so we're going to send that, and you can see that it returns the value just like it did when we were running it local. Okay, so if we go and do a get on that, again, this is up in Azure, you can see the get also worked. It returned this is Pi Day. Now let's go look in Azure and see if it actually saved that. So here's our Azure storage account, and here's the DAPR store container, which is what we defined in our DAPR configuration. Here's our STG value container, and if we go look in there, you can see that this is Pi Day is stored in Azure. So we can do the same thing if you want to use Cosmos DB for your state store. If you want to use Azure Redis for your state store, you can do all of that. And all you need to do is change the configuration of your DAPR sidecar in your container app. So it makes it super easy when you're building it on-prem or on your local machine. It's using your local Redis. As soon as you publish it, it's going to use whatever you have set up in there. Okay. And you can change your local config file to point to that Azure State Store too, if you would rather do that. You don't have to do it with your local one. Question, Mike?
Yeah, in the setting up of local versus deploying on Azure, is there something in the YAML where you can go, hey, look at my environment to go, hey, if I'm in development, use this local config. If I'm not in development, use this Azure config.
Yeah, so no, because that's not really how it works. You define, so like for in Azure, for instance, it's going to use the configuration that you define in that resource, right? So there's not a config file. There's nowhere you need to point it to look. It's just going to know that, okay, I'm in an Azure container app. This is my config file for while I'm in here. While you're local, you can specify where you want that config file to reside, and we'll show you that once we look at some command line stuff for running it locally. But when you're in Azure, it's just going to use the DAPR configuration that you have defined in your container app.
Okay.
Any other questions? All right, cool. Let's move on then. And now, let me make sure. I'm looking at my notes to make sure I don't miss something. So now let's go over and look at our pub sub. So we're going to go look at our pub sub project. So this is, let me find it. So this is our pub sub project. And what I've got here is two projects. I've got a publisher and a subscriber. And you can see the publisher here, again, it's super easy. So I'm publishing events to a pub sub provider. And then we're going to subscribe to those events and listen to them back. So what I'm doing is I'm just setting up a list of companies, and then I'm taking a random double number for the stock price. Because it seems like these days it's almost random anyway, right? If you're watching the stock market, it's just going all over the place. I don't ever know what it is. So this is probably as good a stock ticker as the real thing, I think. So we're going to just get a random stock price for a random company, and we're going to publish that up into our pub sub component, okay, into this topic. So that's all we need to do. This one line of code, along with the initialization of the client up here, is all you need to do to post events into a into like a service bus or a RabbitMQ or any of that stuff, right? And again, in this case, we're using Redis because that's what is local. And so our subscriber here, we're doing the same thing. We just create an HTTP handler that DAPR is going to call every time we get a message into our publish, okay? And you can do this one of two ways. You can do it this way, or you can set up an input binding trigger off of your pub sub provider, right? We're just going to do this because this is super easy. So DAPR is essentially going to call this post every time a message comes in to our provider. Okay, so super simple code. It really doesn't get much easier than this. So let's go see if we can make this thing work. So we're here in our DAPR pub folder. So this is the folder for our publishing project. And what we want to do is, if you're running DAPR locally and you want to run it with your .NET project, you need to run this command here. So you're going to do DAPR run. Then you're going to give it an app ID, and you need an app ID. If you don't provide an app ID, DAPR will create a random one, but then you don't know what it is, and it's going to be hard to interact with it. So you pass it in an app ID, just something that you want to use. And for this, we're going to give it a port. Since we're using that HTTP listener in our subscriber, this is the port that it's going to listen on. And then we pass in the resources path. And this is the path where your YAML files for your components reside, okay? So if we go look at that in our pub sub project here, let me find that. So we have this components folder right here. Now, by default, it puts it into your user profile /.dapr folder. That's where it's going to use. Those are the components it's going to use by default unless you specify a different path. I want to specify a different path because I want to define what components I'm going to use. So we go into this components, and you'll see that we have our pub sub YAML file, and this is what that looks like. So it's just going to our Redis host here locally, okay? And so I'm passing that resources path, and then you do a -- and then a .NET run. So it's going to set up your DAPR container, and then it's going to run your Docker container, and they're going to work together. So when we go ahead and hit enter on this, okay, now we're up and running. So DAPR's running, my .NET application is running, and you can see that we are pushing all of these different events up to our publisher, okay? So now let's go over to our subscriber, and we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to run DAPR with that. But this time we're going to run it here in our subscription folder, and we should start seeing messages come through. So you see how it went so fast? That's because there were a bunch of messages already built up, and now it's receiving the message here in our subscriber that our publisher is sending, okay? So that's a really easy way to do pub sub. Now what we can do here is if we stop these, if I go back one directory, okay, let me show you this. So we have in here another tie.yaml file, and you can see that we have a couple of services here. We have our publisher service, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to run DAPR, run, blah, 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 all that same thing I just did on the command line. And then we're going to run our subscriber service the same way that we did our command line. But this way we can do it by configuration, and then all we have to do is come over here and type in tie run. And it's going to fire up both the DAPR, it's going to fire up both services, and it's going to do all of that in one shot. And then we're going to have this nice little tie dashboard that we can go take a look at. And if we go look at the tie dashboard, you can see that we have our publisher service running and our subscriber service running, and we can go look at the logs for both of them. So you can see that this is publishing the information. If we go back to look at our logs for our subscriber, you can see that it's subscribing to the information. Now, one of the other cool little things that DAPR gives you is it gives you built-in observability. So when you're on your local machine, I talked about that Zipkin container earlier. That is what gives you local visibility. And if you look at your Docker for Windows, you can see that our Zipkin container is running on port 9411. So we can come here and we can go to HTTP localhost 9411. And that gives us our Zipkin dashboard. And we can run a query, and this shows all of the different things that our services are doing in our Zipkin dashboard. And we can look at each item and even go look at details for each item, and it gives us all kinds of information about that. So it really provides you deep observability into what your services are doing. And you can even go get a dependency chart, and this shows you a graphical view of everything that's going on in your DAPR containers, right? It's really pretty. You can see all kinds of dots flying back and forth, and it looks really cool. But as you get more and more complex systems, this is really handy because it'll make sure that everything is working the way that it's supposed to work. And all you need to do to get that that Zipkin observability is here in your components folder. You put in this config.yaml. So this config.yaml, you say it's a kind of configuration, you give it a name, and then you're going to give it the specs here. And that's going to use your local Zipkin instance to collect all of this stuff. You don't have to do anything in your code. You don't have to do anything in your command line. All you do is include this in your components folder, wherever you're pointing that to, and then DAPR will pick that up and use it for its observability. So there's a couple of cool tools. There's Ty and Zipkin that you can use to really make it easy to do all of this stuff. All right, we're getting close to the end. So I just wanted to show one last thing here. Let's see. So I am going to stop our Ty run. Okay. And I'm going to go back into my, whoops. This is our DAPR pub. Okay. Now, before, when I did the DAPR run, you see that I passed in the components folder into my command line, right? So that went into the components folder, and it took the components, which is using our Azure or our local Redis, right? But I also have this other folder of components, and it's called Azure components, and I'll show that to you if I can. Sorry, I lost my mouse pointer for a second. If we go into here and we go into the Azure components folder, I have this pubsub.yaml here, and you can see that I'm using a service bus, an Azure service bus here. And so I have to provide it a connection string, and this is the connection string to the Azure service bus. And I'm going to delete this so that nobody tries to use my Azure service bus based on this connection string. So don't even try to copy it because it's going away. But anyway, and that's all we need to do. So it's the same config, right? Just with these different parameters, the same exact code. I didn't make a single change to my code, but now we can run it using the Azure service bus rather than the local Redis instance from our local machine. So I'm going to come into here, and I'm going to change this. So the command line is the same, except I'm going to change it to use the Azure components folder for my resources instead of the regular components folder. So when I run that, okay, we're up and running. It's going, and we should start seeing stuff going through. And there we go. So now it's sending the data, but now it's sending it up into Azure rather than local. So if I come to my subscriber, and I do the exact same thing, except, and I point it to the Azure components, it too is going to use Azure, and it's going to start receiving the data from the Azure storage bus, not from the Redis on local. So if we go look at, I think I have that in here. So this is the topic. So I set up a subscription just to monitor that. You see, we had 0 messages. If I refresh this, you can now see we have 40 messages. So you can see that my project on-prem on my local machine is sending the data up into Azure, and all I had to do was use a different config file to have it do that. So it was going to Redis, change the config file, now it's going to Azure. And you can do that with any of the PubSub providers or the PubSub components. I could do the same thing. I could change my config file to use RabbitMQ or use something up in AWS. I don't have to change my code. I just have to change my config file. And remember that DAPR handles all of the underlying plumbing that you need to make your microservices resilient and scalable and secure. It uses MTLS that you can implement. And all of this kind of stuff is just built right into DAPR. So you don't have to worry about it. You just have to worry about your business logic and let DAPR handle all the stuff underneath. So that is, I believe, all I have. Oh man, and that was almost perfect timing. So these are some resources that you can use if you're interested. There's some really good YouTube videos on DAPR. There's some good GitHub stuff. There's the URL for Project Ty, and just all kinds of good information. And then there's my information. If you need to contact me, I'm available. Now, I haven't used DAPR for long. I just learned about it recently myself, but it's something that I'm really excited to get into. And like I said, you know, a lot of times you get a little bit worried. Well, is this something that's just going to fade away? Is it going to be supported? You know, stuff like that. But the very fact that Microsoft includes it by default as a service in their Azure container apps is a big thing for DAPR, and that kind of tells you that they're fully behind it and they're going to support it. So, thank you very much. Are there any questions before we wrap this up?
I think it was Troy Fillerup that said, "Is it getting easier?"
I know, right?
How long did it take you to get all this? How long did it take you to get this all up and running?
So this took me a few hours. I worked on it for a while on Sunday, and it took me a little while to get it all put together. And it was like, I tell you, I ran into some problems, but I learned some big lessons. So if you run into problems doing this, let me know, because I ran into probably several of them and I figured them out. So if you do decide to play with this, you know, feel free to reach out and we can talk about it. So
Excellent. Thank you.
any other questions?
I'm just
All right.
curious if anyone has been using this with AWS. I know that's a dirty word in a Microsoft-centered presentation, but
No, absolutely.
at
I
the
mean-
state we have been, we use .NET with AWS, and I'm just curious if this would fit into that ecosystem.
Very well. Very, very well. In fact, let me show you. There are actually some big companies using this day to day. So these are some of the companies that are using it. Bosch, Man. I've never heard of them, but I was looking at some of their stuff. They're doing a lot with DAPR. And so these are some of the things Alibaba is actually a big proponent of DAPR, and they have all the AWS services built into DAPR. So it's all there. AWS is definitely a first-class citizen in the DAPR ecosystem. Now, I don't know if AWS has built-in support for it like the Azure does, because I haven't looked into that. But if it doesn't, again, all of these are accessible just as DAPR or Docker sidecars. So if you're using Docker containers, you can use this anywhere. And it's natively supported by Kubernetes. So it's super easy to deploy this into a Kubernetes cluster. And it's just built for microservices. So Azure, AWS, GCP, Alibaba, it doesn't really matter what cloud platform you use, DAPR can support it.
Cool. Thanks, Troy.
Yep. Okay. Thank you, everybody. It was great having you here. And like I said, feel free to reach out if you need to. Thank you very much.